Before, the deaf would just agree with this oppression. They would think that the labels hearing impaired and the deaf and dumb are fine, no problem, their language is a problem, and they didn't do anything about the oppression. Things started to change when deaf culture and ASL were recognized as their own. All of the oppression and the terms were pushed aside, and they decided, no, they can label themselves. They identified themselves as deaf rather than hearing impaired. They put the oppression terms down and decided that their communication was sign language. They started to feel motivated now that they had this new self-identity. Their attitudes changed, and also they recognized themselves to be who they were as a person. They saw their parents as a group and their teachers as a group. When a group of hearing parents have a deaf child, they tend to go to the doctor first and get the doctor's opinion. The parents would ask the doctor what the best way to do is. They would ask the doctor for advice on whether or not their child should have a cochlear or use the oral method for communication. Well, the deaf people would look at that and say, no, that's wrong. You should raise your child with sign language, and they would explain the different ways for parents to communicate with their child. They would encourage the parents to bring their child to events and use ASL. The deaf people would teach the parents ASL, help teach the child ASL, and invite them out to deaf events where they could socialize and learn and meet new deaf people. They would encourage the parents to come join, and they would be welcoming. I missed most of what he said there. Nowadays, it's more common for hearing parents to sign to their children, and they sign just as well as deaf parents do sometimes, about on the same level. They sign with their children. It's not as it was before. Okay, so thinking back, remember how the amount of deaf teachers shrank a lot in hearing schools? the hearing teachers at deaf schools kind of took over that, and they were socializing with deaf, and they just took over. I know what he said, I just can't put it in words. Deaf teachers would copy from, or hearing teachers would copy from deaf teachers and learn and change their ways and change their language skills so they would have better ASL skills. Something like that. Before, everyone would say English is very important. But realize that that meant for deaf people, it was always just reading and writing, reading and writing. Because that's all how they could communicate in English with the rest of the world. So they emphasized the importance of English because that was the best way to communicate out in the world, in the business world, to earn money, to have a successful life. It was always emphasized that reading and writing skills were very important. Well, now the deaf, knowing that sign language was a language and recognized as one, they said, well, my language is important too. I'm bilingual. I have skills in ASL, skills in sign that are the same as my reading and writing skills in English. And teachers recognized that, and they decided it was important to encourage the students to be skilled in both English and sign language. How would they do this exactly? Well, they would make sure that language learning did not only take place at home and in the classroom, but also within the community. They would encourage the students to go out into the deaf community and learn more and build their language skills. It's important for building skills that you also understand the culture. Deaf also emphasized the importance of English. They did this by encouraging reading. And with deaf children, they would look at a book and then see somebody signing it. So they wouldn't necessarily understand the words the first time they were reading it, but they would understand it when they saw somebody signing it. The students would really enjoy reading and fall in love with reading, and that would encourage their English learning skills. That force change. If the student never read, that would mean they were not. That doesn't necessarily mean they can't read, it just means that they're not a very good reader and were never encouraged to read. You can communicate with the world better if you improve your English skills and your reading and writing skills. For the deaf, it is very important to be bilingual and skilled in both ASL and English. It means that they can see the world and see things that are happening in the world, and they can recognize and make change. Now, I've explained the history from all the way in the past to where the deaf had found their identity up until now. Literacy means that I'm free. I am able to do what I want to do, and I can be a bridge to change and change in the world. And this is not only in one culture, this is throughout every culture in the world. You can see it. It's important to know that if deaf didn't have their identity and their culture and their community, they would still be the same as it was a long time ago. they would still be accepting what other people were putting on them. You see more deaf children now in residential schools across the country. There's 60 residential schools around the country. Went from 20 to 70, 80% of students in the schools being deaf. The 80% of students who are not in residential schools are mainstreamed in other programs. And those students don't recognize themselves with a deaf identity. Those students focus more on being mainstreamed. They grow up having a hearing mindset. I'm really not that sure. They see the deaf signing and they look down on it. They prefer English. They prefer to be in the hearing world rather than in the deaf community. They think that they can't accept the fact that they're deaf. They have a negative attitude towards it. And they think that they must speak in order to be considered smart. If deaf students transfer to a mainstream program from a residential school, they find themselves having communication issues with the other students who are deaf but don't sign, they don't know ASL. Those residential school deaf students encourage and support the students who are in the hearing world that don't know sign language. They teach them and work with them. So in that mainstream area. If your children are happy with themselves, as your parents, you must get them to their happy place. Doesn't sound right. deaf people in the community must encourage the parents to make the right decisions and make the right choices for their children. Remember my explanation of hearing parents and deaf children mainstreamed in... I'm not really sure where he's going with that. Deaf children tend to be upset if their parents don't sign. So I remember this story of one student whose parents were invited to the school for a parent-teacher conference, and the teacher was explaining to the parents about the child and how he's been upset. Well, after that meeting, the boy was at school again and he was so happy. And the teacher asked him why he was so happy. He said it was because his parents are a little bit deaf now, meaning that they learned a little bit of sign language. So just remember that a little bit means a lot to the student, to your child.